Learning objectives. After completing this module, learners will be able to explain the life of tribal groups, enlist the ways in which colonial rule affected tribal life, discuss forest laws and their impact, recall the problems associated with trade, describe the efforts of Birsa Munda for the tribal groups. Life of tribals. In mid-1870s, Birsa was born in a family of Mundas, a tribal group that lived in Chota Nagpur. The tribes had customs and rituals that were very different from the customs and rituals of the Brahmins. How did tribal groups live? Tribal people were involved in a variety of activities in different parts of India by the 19th century. Some were jhum cultivators. Jhum cultivation or shifting cultivation was done on small area of land in forests. The cultivators cut the treetops, allowing the sunlight to reach ground. The vegetation was burnt on the land for cultivation. Once the crop was ready and harvested, the cultivators shifted to another field and left the field uncultivated for several years. Some were hunters and gatherers. Hunting animals and gathering forest produce was the main livelihood for some tribal groups. The Konds were hunters and gatherers living in the forests of Orissa. They used many forest shrubs and herbs for medicinal purpose and sold forest produce in the local markets. Baigas of central India regarded themselves as the people of forest and were unwilling to work as labor for others. Tribal groups required to buy and sell goods that were not produced within the locality. This led to their dependence on traders and money lenders. Some herded animals. Many tribal groups lived by herding and rearing animals and gathering forest produce. Tribal groups who moved with their herds of cattle or sheep according to the seasons were called pastoralists. Example, cattle herders, the Van Gujjars of Punjab Hills and the Labadis of Andhra Pradesh. Shepherds, the Gaddis of Kullu. Goat rearers, the Bakarwals of Kashmir. Some took to settled cultivation. Many tribal groups had begun to settle down instead of moving from one place to another. They began to use the plough and got rights over the land they lived on. Tribal groups like the Gonds and Santhals were more civilized than the hunter-gatherers or shifting cultivators, according to the British officials. Effect of colonial rule on tribals. What happened to tribal chiefs? Before the arrival of the British, tribal chiefs enjoyed economic power and had the right to administer and control their territories. Under British rule, the power and functioning of the tribal chiefs changed, as they were allowed to keep their land titles but were forced to follow laws made by British officials in India. What happened to the shifting cultivators? The British were uncomfortable with the shifting cultivators. The British wanted to regularize revenue source for the state, so land settlements were introduced by British. The British effort to settle jhum cultivators was not successful. After facing widespread protests, the British allowed jhum cultivators the right to carry on shifting cultivation in some parts of the forest. Forest laws and their impact. The life of tribal groups was directly connected to the forest. The forests were declared as state property by the British. Reserved forests were for producing timber which the British wanted. In reserved forests, people were not allowed to move freely or practice jhum cultivation. Many tribal groups reacted against the colonial forest laws and rose in an open rebellion. Problems with trade. The problem with trade. During the 19th century, tribal groups found the traders and money lenders were coming into forests and offering cash loans to the tribal people and asking them to work for wages. Indian silk was in demand because of its fine quality in European markets during the 18th century. The Santals of Hazirbagh reared cocoons. The traders dealing in silk sent their agents to give loans to the tribal people and collect the cocoons in return. The cocoons were exported to Burdwan or Gaya, where they were sold at 5 times the purchasing price. The search for work. The condition of the tribal groups who had to go far away from their homes in search of work was worse. The tribal groups were recruited in large numbers to work for tea plantations and coal mines through contractors at low wages, and also prevented them from returning home. In 1920, tribal in the mines of Bihar were made to work deep down in the dark, dangerous and suffocating mines. In 1920s, over 2,000 workers died every year due to adverse working condition of Indian mines. Regional revolts against the British. A closer look. The tribal groups rebelled against the changes in laws, restrictions on their practices, the new taxes they had to pay, and exploitation by traders and money lenders. In 1831-32, the Kols rebelled. In 1855, Santals rose in a revolt. In 1910, Bastar rebellion in central India broke out. In 1940, the Worli revolt in Maharashtra was observed. Birsa Munda. Birsa Munda was an Indian tribal freedom fighter, religious leader and folk hero who belonged to the Munda tribe. He spearheaded an Indian tribal religious movement that arose in the tribal belt of modern-day Bihar and Jharkhand in the late 19th century. The British officials were worried as the political aim of the Birsa movement was to drive out missionaries, money lenders, Hindu landlords and the government and set up a Munda Raj with Birsa at its head. In 1895, Birsa Munda was arrested. He was released in 1897 and he toured the villages to gather support. He urged people to destroy Ravana, Dikus and the European and establish a kingdom under his leadership. In 1900, Birsa died of cholera and the movement gradually faded. Summary. Let us summarize what we have learned. By the 19th century, tribal people in different parts of India were involved in a variety of activities. Under the British rule, the functions and powers of the tribal chiefs changed, as they were allowed to keep their land titles but were forced to follow laws made by British officials in India. The British wanted to regular revenue source for the state and introduced land settlements. During the 19th century, tribal groups found the traders and money lenders were coming into forests and offering cash loans to the tribal people and asking them to work for wages. The tribals were recruited in large numbers to work for tea plantations and coal mines through contractor at low wages and prevented them from returning home. The British officials were worried as the political aim of the Birsa movement was to drive out missionaries, moneylenders, Hindu landlords and the government and set up a Munda Raj with Birsa at its head.